Hi, everyone. So we'll get started here. It's noon. So welcome everyone back to the Mindscope webinar series. Today is our 6th session so far this year. So thank you everyone for coming out so far and making it such a success. For those of you joining for the first time, my name is Charlotte. I work in marketing at Mindscope and I will be your host today. And then today we're going to be switching things up a little bit. Today we actually have our Chief Operations Officer, Josh. He'll be walking us through the session. Today we'll be walking through process evaluation. So what that means is we'll be looking at things like how to document your current recruiting workflow, how to identify some inefficiencies and how to address them, and most importantly, how Mindscope can help with the process. So we'll get started in just a couple minutes, but if you've got any questions the session, just leave them in the chat section. And if everyone can just keep themselves on mute throughout the session, just to avoid any background noise, that would be awesome. So Josh, do you want to take it away?
Will do. Thanks, Charlotte. So hello, everyone. My name is Josh. I've been in the staffing industry for 20 odd years now. Makes me sound older than I actually am, I think. And one of the things that we've consistently heard from our customers over the years, whether it's with our ATS or other ATSs, is that it's difficult to put into context all of the activities that you might have in your ATS to really organize your workflow. So if we look at, I imagine the vast majority here have seen legacy Mindscope and new Mindscope. We have a lot of activity, stuff that your recruiters do on a daily basis, right? You might make a phone call, a screening phone call, or maybe it's a post-interview phone call for a client. You're trying to do a QC call. All these activities that we generally do, and we just kind of, sometimes it might be we put in a note, sometimes we don't document the note. There's the overreaching arc of feedback that we get is that it's hard to enforce consistency, right? Especially when you're working with larger teams or you're working with teams of recruiters, ensuring that everybody works the same way, and you're capturing data that's meaningful to you, to make determinations on your process, right? What's the effort? So how many pre-screens do you have to do to get a suitable candidate that you want to interview? How many internal interviews do you have to do before you get a resume that you want to submit to your client? How many times do you have to submit to your client before they're actually going to meet somebody? How many times do they have to meet somebody before they actually get a placement? All this stuff that we would like to know, for a lot of our customers and recruiting in general, is the information is not there because we're not consistently entering the information the same way. So one of the challenges we took on when we started designing the new UI was really how do we present the job orders, because that's where the bulk of the activity is done. I mean, obviously you have candidate and client module, but the bulk of the effort is done in the job order module. So how do we structure the job order in such a way that it can be flexible, but it can also allow you to enforce a level of consistency in operation. So what we've seen, or what we did was the new job order workflow, the new job order pipeline. So I just want to take a step back and kind of introduce it again for those who may not be 100% familiar with it. If we're looking at legacy Mindscope, when we're looking at a job order, we would see you have these lists in the left pane here, then you'll have open job orders, and then under it you might have several different candidate lists that you work with. You can have an applied list. You might. Yep.
Sorry, I don't think we're able to see your screen. Actually.
Oh, that's actually a very good point. I'm sorry. Thanks.
No problem.
It always helps to share out, right? Can you guys see my screen now?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So just to take a step back, what you see in legacy Mindscope is you would see a whole bunch of different lists. So if you have an applied list, if you run 5, 6, 7 searches for a job because you can't quite find the right talent, you know, you end up with these trees under the job order. And if you're interacting with a lot of different candidates across multiple lists, it can be difficult to not only record activities, but understand accurately where you stand from a candidate submission process, the entire workflow. So we decided to redesign that, right? So now in the new UI, what you would see at the top is you would see every single stage of the workflow that you've built, which we'll talk about in a minute, and the number of candidates that you have in each stage, as well as we've changed where you find the individual lists. So let me just dive right in. So the first thing we've done is we've introduced an area called workspace, and the workspace really is the entry point to your job order. So you would have, and forgive me, this is a test database that I just kind of quickly created a job order in. I would have under the applied candidates list, it's where you would get all of your candidate applications. So all of your web applicants come in there. Manual list is where you would manually attach candidates to a job. So, you know, you might want to consider them. You're not necessarily ready to screen them and so forth. The inactive list would be anybody that you rejected. And then you have the candidate match section which is designed to allow you to basically run a whole bunch of different searches. And the nice thing about that is that all the searches remain at the job order level. So right now, if if I'm running a search in the candidate module and I go away and come back, well, you know, that search is specific to me, and my colleagues won't know what I've done. Whereas if I run the search at the job order level, the search stays static in the job order and everybody can see the search that I've done, see the list of candidates that I've looked at. So it really helps. Again, our goal was to bring everything to the job order level. Now, what really makes this interesting is the pipeline. So if I run a search, and again, this is a test database, I'm going to just run, I think I should have a few Smiths in here. So I'm just going to run a quick search for, I have 6 candidates with the last name Smith in my database, right? So again, if I run a whole bunch of searches, I have these different lists under my job order. And what's interesting now is I'm no longer jumping back and forth from list to list to list to figure out who's where. If I decide that I want to talk to Nick and introduce him to my workflow process, if I move him to the pipeline, he's off limits, but that's okay. Now, when I go into my job order, I can see that I have one candidate in my pipeline, one candidate in my screening stage, and I'm ready to start working with them. So all of this is just kind of to demonstrate that what we've done is we've tried to structure so to remove the noise. So what you need to keep in mind before we start talking about workflow proper is the difference between the workspace and the pipeline. The workspace is really what we would consider your scratch pad area, where you can have different lists of candidates, look quickly through applied candidate lists and so forth. And your pipeline is really the focused area, candidates that you've decided that I want to engage in with this for this mandate. So, I've got 500, in a very, very attractive position. I've got 500 job applicants from Indeed. I can quickly go through them, look at the resumes with the resume preview, decide which ones I want to reject, which ones I want to engage with. The ones I want to engage with, I move to the pipeline and I start logging my phone calls. So, again, you're no longer jumping from list to list to figure out who am I engaging with. We present it in kind of a succinct view for you in the pipeline. Now, where this becomes interesting is you can actually have multiple types of pipeline. So the only thing that we mandate is that you have at least 2 stages. So in this workflow here, I have 7 different stages. I have a screening stage, internal interviews, my external interviews, my external submissions, my external interviews, my candidate assessments, background checks, offers, and then ultimately leading to placements. You can build very specific workflows, whether it's for a line of business that you have, whether it's for perm versus temp. You can even create very client-specific workflows. And when you create the job order, you can select then which workflow that you want to work with. And as you attach candidates to the job, well, then we ensure that you move the candidate through that process. So if I look at this workflow, So if I look at this workflow, what I have is I have a whole bunch of, initial activities. So this is where we start talking about what do you really want to capture, right? So, I've had these workflow calls with, dozens of customers. And we start talking about, well, what do you do? What do your recruiters do? What's your process? And what I'm hearing a lot is it's people have difficulty, perhaps, putting pen to paper and saying, well, this is my process. So the first thing I'm going to tell you to do is evaluate, try and break down your entire candidate management process in the job order in steps, right? So, again, if we're talking high level screening, all right, you have a screening stage. When you're at the initial screening stage with your candidate, what are you doing, right? And when I say what are you doing, I mean, you as business leaders or operations folks or recruiters, what do you want to account for? What do you want to make sure gets done? So for example, I know there's an effort, every time I pick up the phone and try and reach a candidate, that's time out of my day. That's time that I would like to account for. So I'm going to have in my screening stage, I have an activity which I refer to as attempt to connect. So basically that means that, if I'm trying to screen 50 candidates and, out of them, I actually had 10 successful screening calls and I had to leave, 40 detailed voicemail messages, well, that still has a value to the business. And it's something that I would like to be able to report on. So when I'm talking, as a business leader, if I'm talking to a recruiter or an account manager and saying, well, what are we doing to increase the candidate volume on this? We can say, well, I did screen 10 people, but I also, tried to reach 40 people. And then you can actually measure how many people call you back by recording the follow-up activities. But it's all around what do you concretely want to know about, what do you want people to record, and how do you want to move them through the process. So again, we're talking about screening. So in screening, I would have, I would have a phone screen. I might have a screen not required. And then I have an attempt to connect. So how does that work in my workflow? All right, well, I have a candidate, I just moved this candidate to the pipeline, right? So what I'm going to do is I would say, okay, well, I'm going to try and reach him. And if I can't reach him, then I'm going to log the fact that I made an attempt to connect. So, this would be my note or whatever I want it to be. So now the attempt to connect activity is recorded against the candidate. I get credit for it because I spent time out of my day to do it. But as you see, because of the way I've designed this workflow, I can't move my candidate forward yet. Why not? Because this particular workflow, I say there are two things that are mandatory, or one of two things is mandatory. Either I document the fact that I did a phone screen, or I formally document that a screening is not required. Because there are going to be concrete real-world situations where I spoke to Nick yesterday about another identical job, and I know he's interested, I know he's available, and I know he's a really good candidate. I'm not going to, I might call him later to say, hey, I've got another identical job, but I'm not going to go through the whole screening process with him again, right? So I would then document screening not required. That would allow me to move Nick to the next stage in my process. So again, this is entirely customizable, and you can, choose to make a screening required every time. You can choose to add offsetting activities. So, again, when you're talking to recruiters, document either you do a phone screen or you don't do a phone screen, but you document why a phone screen was not done, because that helps you control quality as you're working through the submission process with your client. So in this case here, I'm just going to say, screening not required. So, so I met with Nick yesterday, done. So the minute I record that, I can move Nick to my internal interview stage, right? And again, I'm getting a warning here because it's off limits, but we'll ignore that. That's for a different topic. So now Nick is in my second stage. So if I pull out of my job for whatever reason and come back in, I know just by quickly looking at it where I have candidates in each of my workflow steps, or stages, I know exactly how many candidates I have and how they're doing in the process. So let's say it's tomorrow and I want to, look at Nick for an internal interview. I can quickly look and see the activities that were completed. So, I have my attempt to connect, and then I have my completed screening not required. So you can quickly see all the activities that have happened with that candidate. But then you look at the next step. So again, it's all about workflow structure. So in my internal interview stage, I'm going to document, what do I want to track? I'm tracking my internal interview. I'm tracking the fact that I might have rejected the candidate internally. I'm possibly that the candidate's not interested in the position, so rejected by candidate, or an internal interview is not required. Again, what I typically recommend when you're evaluating your workflow and building out a workflow is have offsetting. If you have an activity that's absolutely essential, I always recommend putting an offsetting activity that's required, that your team can document why they didn't do an internal. So for example, here, I had an internal interview is required, but I also have an activity internal interview not required. And then my role as a business leader is, if I see an internal interview not required, I'm going to look at the notes to see why they're saying an internal interview is not required. And I'm also going to look at the metrics. And if I look through, all of the work that one of my team members is doing, and then all of their, as they're moving all the candidates through their pipeline, they're saying everyone internal interview is not required, I'm probably going to sit down and start asking some questions, right? But I recommend nonetheless having an offsetting activity, just because you're going to manage those occasional exceptions where you don't need to perform a task. So in the internal interview stage, again, I'm going to record the fact that I did an internal interview. I would potentially, again, reject internally. So I'm going to, let's say here, I'm going to record the internal interview, and I'm going to reject by candidate, or reject internally, let's say. So I'm going to, as you see, I have two task windows, and I can say internal interview. So let's just, my interview is done. And then I'm going to save this activity, and then I'm going to say rejected internally, and then forgot Nick is off limits, right? So I can't use him. So I'm going to save this activity here, and boom, Nick is no longer in my pipeline. I've rejected him internally. Nick goes to my workspace. He's now in my inactive list because I rejected him, right? So what does that do? That, from a job order management perspective, we track all of these activities. So if you want to get a sense of what's going on at each stage, so in the screening stage, hold on, which one? So there's two. There was an old one here. So I can see all the activities that happen in the screening stage. I could look at the external submission stage, whatever. So you can actually break it down to see what's happening. And we're actually working on reports and metrics that are going to feed into a completely new page within Mindscope for this. All right. So now I'm going to actually go back here, and I'll add another candidate to the workspace, to the pipeline, so we can actually work them through it. And I'm actually going to run that same search, because I want to show you something else real quick. So I'm going to run the search for Smith again. So something interesting, if we're collaboratively working on a whole bunch of people working on the job order, I ran the same search. I have Nick here, but Nick now shows up with a red bar next to his name, which tells me that he's already been rejected for this job. Okay, so we don't restrict the view of candidates, but just kind of a visual indicator here to let you know that there's a red X on Nick because he was already rejected. So I'm going to take John here. I'm going to move him to my pipeline. Well, let's take John and Chloe, move them both to the pipeline. So now I have two people in my screening stage, right? So take action. I'm going to say again here, screening not required, because I just want to move through quickly. Done, save. And then I'm going to move to next and take action, and we will move to the next stage. All right. So quickly, there's a question from, before I continue, there's a question from David. Can the job order workflow be named by client instead of version 1 or whatever? Yeah. So you can absolutely change the name of the workflow. Okay. That's in the setup for the system admins. It can be called whatever you want. We're always going to show the version number of the workflow next to it, but you will be able to change the name of the workflow. Okay. We're actually going to enhance that to allow you to create default workflows and tag them to clients. So when you create job orders for that client, it can automatically apply a workflow. So that's That's coming. It'll be there by the end of the summer. All right, so I'm going to move to next. Now, again, talking about process, if I go to external submission, so if I look at my workflow template, I have, again, activities. I have resume submitted to the employer via Mindscope. Again, you have rejected by client. I have a submission follow-up activity, and I have a resume submitted to employer externally option. So again, when you're evaluating and building your workflow, what did I do here? Well, I know in this stage that I need to get the resume to the client. I could potentially send the resume via Mindscope. There are occasions where I might send the resume outside of Mindscope. So maybe I'm sending it via Outlook, so I'm sending a whole bunch of documents, or I'm sending some customized marketing materials. So maybe I've done it outside of Mindscope. So I'm going to do the external submission. Then what else happens in there? Once I've sent a resume to a client, I know that I want my recruiters to do a follow-up. So I have a submission follow-up, and I mean, I wouldn't book an interview with the client unless I got follow-up from the client. Say, yeah, good resume. I want to meet the candidate. So I'm going to ask my recruiters to record that follow-up conversation. And then, you know, if either the ending result there is either I move the candidate forward to the external interview stage, or I'm going to simply say that, nope, this candidate's no good. The resume was rejected by the client. Again, you know, and I might sound like a broken record, but it's what you need to do is evaluate what you want to capture that's meaningful to your process. You know, I've seen customers that have very, very basic workflows, and they're very happy with that, and it works for them. And then I have customers that I've seen who are extremely detailed in the number of items that they want their recruiters to document. So this is, again, we've built it to be very flexible. But I still recommend when you take a step, when you sit down and try and, you know, write out your workflow, you say, okay, well, if I have this stage, you know, my external submission stage, what am I going to ask my recruiters to do? Well, I'm going to ask them to send the resume. I'm going to ask them to follow up with the client. I'm going to document whether the client wants to meet the candidate or not. So that's kind of how you would build the workflow within Mindscope. And then we go into, you know, so in this case here, I'm going to take action again, moving the candidate forward while I'm in this stage, my external interviews. So I'm going to just say, you know, for the sake of it, that I've sent the resume to the client outside of Mindscope, just because of this test here. Oh no, I went back. Hold on. Send it within Mindscope. I don't actually want to do in Mindscope, so I don't want to send an email right now. So I'm going to say resume submitted outside of Mindscope, and done. Okay. So just recording, and the way my workflow is built, it's required in order to be able to move the candidate forward, but it's one or the other. So either I sent the resume outside of Mindscope or within Mindscope. Move to next, and then I get, you know, I recorded my follow-up activity. Client says, great profile, want to meet the candidate. Well, then you can actually start recording the type of interview. So my first employer in-person interview, I'm going to schedule it. In this case here, that's the activity is not completed. It's going to be in progress or not started. And the interview is scheduled for, you know, let's say the interview is scheduled for Monday at 12 p.m. Okay. So my interview is scheduled for Monday at 12 p.m. So if I look at Chloe's activities, I'm going to see the external interviews. It's in progress. And so, you know, if I leave this job order, then go back in, the customer calls me and says, hey, I'm supposed to meet somebody tomorrow. I can't remember who it is. You pull up the job order and you go right away to the external interviews tab, and you can say, oh, well, I can see that Chloe is the one that's there. And, you know, if I look at the activity, I can actually see when it's scheduled. So you have all that information right here. You're not running around trying to figure out, okay, let me look at the whole bunch of different lists, see who's where. No, you open up the job order and say, well, yeah, you've got one person that's scheduled for external interviews. It's not completed yet, so that it's going to be Chloe, and we go, right? So I can actually go in here once the interview is done. I can just click on the pencil and change the status to complete and enter a note if I have one, right? I'm going to also take the next action, where I'm going to do my, you know, interview follow-up. So I just made a bunch of phone calls. I've spoken to the candidate and I've spoken to the client. I'm going to record both of those activities. So I'm going to put this is a client follow-up, and I'm going to save it. And then I'll go over to candidate follow-up. You'll be happy to know as well that we're going to pretty soon have a save all button here, so you won't have to save them individually. I'm very excited about that. So I've just saved both activities, recorded both activities. And now, because I've completed in my workflow all of the required activities, I can now move the candidate forward, right? So the client said, hey, this is really good. I really would like you to move forward with the assessments on the candidate, and we can go. So again, we track by stage all of the activities that have taken place. Keep in mind that all the activities that you see here are things that we're going to be able to report on. You'll be able to quantify now how many external interviews you had to do to get a placement. The numbers are going to be a lot more apparent, and like I said, we're building a job metrics page that's going to give you a lot of insight here that will be there relatively soon as well. So move to next. So this is also interesting. If in my workflow I have an assessment section, so depending on my client or whatever, I might have health and safety assessment, I might have a skills assessment, it might be a software test. I can make it required or not. In this case here, I just put it in as an optional step. So when you build a workflow, you can have optional activities. So if I'm here and I'm moving Chloe forward, when I say move to next, you can see I see the two stages. I see assessments and I see background. So I can go to assessments or I can bypass assessments completely because I don't need to do any. So for this particular job, this particular client, don't need to, or they were already done. I'm going to move Chloe over. Now Chloe's in my background stage. In my background stage, again, take action. So I don't have a lot here that's required, but for my internal controls, I've decided that I am never going to place a candidate unless I have documented reference checks. So I can, in this case here, I'm going to complete a reference check, document the reference check was done. Maybe we will upload the reference check to the candidate record, or you enter the notes. I've seen some customers that just copy and paste questions that they've asked into the notes box, and they'll go through and type in the answers from the reference. You can save it, or this just again documenting that a reference is done, because if your internal control is that a reference has to be done, you might end up with sometimes recruiters, I've been there, done that. You might cut a corner because you're in a crunch for time, and something falls on you where, hey, this didn't work out as planned, and well, didn't you check reference? And you go back and say, well, we don't have any references on file, but you documented that references were done. Why did we do that, right? So again, all of this is to help you structure your workflow and ensure quality and consistency in your process. So I'm going to say move to next. I'm at the offer stage here. At the offer stage, I can't create a placement until I've created the mandatory actions. So the only thing I have here is I have to document the fact that an offer was extended and that an offer was accepted, right? So I can put in my notes. So this is my offer extended note, and then and then this would be the offer accepted. So spoke with Chloe, accepted, right? And then I can close the window. So now that I've documented all of those activities, the system's now going to let me place Chloe. So what have we done? We've, if we go back in and look at everything we've done, these are all the activities, and I guess that's kind of what I wanted to show you. When I'm talking to people, they go, well, we call them and we send them out, and we might do a reference, or we might do this, and we place them. People have a hard time quantifying or realizing that there are actually a tremendous number of activities that you have to go through to move the candidate through a job order. So, sitting down and thinking about the process, writing down the stages and the activities that you want, really gives you some insight into what you've done with that candidate, how you've managed them. The fun thing here is that it's going to be a consistent management process. You're always going to move candidates through the job orders in the same way. I mean, When I say that, I mean, you know, based off the workflow, you can have different workflows for different clients. You know, I set up a workflow with a client where they said, I can never even submit a resume to the client unless I have 2 references on file. So we built a workflow where before you can get to the resume submitted stage, they have to document reference 1, reference 2, complete. Now I can move the candidate forward. And setting up workflows is not complicated. You would do it under, your system administrator would go under My Company. You can add activities. You see all the different workflows that I've got here that I've been testing out. So you can, this is where you would give the stage a name, add the individual activities that you want, and then save it and attach it to a job order. You're going to probably have to evaluate the activities that you have. So, which is why I said I don't recommend looking at Mindscope and saying, how do I make this fit? What I recommend doing is evaluating your process, writing it down, saying, I have this stage, and this stage. These are the activities that I want my recruiters to do. These are the activities that I would like them to document. I can live without them being documented. And then what we'll do, you can do with the with our help, if necessary, is we would then help you identify the activities that you have in Mindscope. Do you have activities to fit all of these things that you've documented? Do we have to maybe add new activities to Mindscope for you? Or if you want to add new activities, do you need to rename activities? But the first step is, I don't recommend you looking at the activities in Mindscope and saying, how do I make it fit? That's not what you want to do. If you're trying to build a solid workflow, take a step back, documents stage by stage what you're doing and what you actually want to not only require people to do, but what would you like to gain insight into? You know, if it's, I want to know my conversion rate, how many resumes do I have to submit versus, you know, getting an interview? So what's your resume submission conversion rate? Well, that's, in order to do that, you need to track consistently how many resumes you're submitting to the client. So that's the approach I recommend you take. We're here to help as necessary. Do we have, are there questions? Again, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions on my end that I can read out. Let me just find them here. Can you have multiple lists within one job order?
Absolutely. So if I go back to my job order, I was in job order. Which one was I in? Was it 185? Let me just rerun this search. It was Mindscope.
Oh.
Rerun search. Because it's the, oh, there it is. I should have scrolled down. So when you're looking at your workspace, we were talking about the three basic lists, right? You have the applied list, the manual list, the inactive list. But as you can see here, you're also going to have this listing of all the other searches that you've run. They create basically workspace lists. So if I go here and I do another search for, let's say, general information, I'm just looking for available candidates as an example, right? So I end up with this list here, but I have this carousel view. I would actually, all of these searches that I do stay static under the job order. So then I can, again, start screening my candidates, looking at the summaries of the candidates and deciding which candidates I want to move into my pipeline, right? And then the ones I want to engage with, I actually move to the pipeline. The workspace is really to manage your lists, quick lists, and the pipeline is people you're engaging with. Does that answer the question?
I believe so, yeah. Thank you. And then another question I've got here, you mentioned that you can have multiple different workflows.
Yes.
So are those multiple workflows viewed by everyone or only if you have or give access?
Right now they are public. So if you create a workflow, it's available to anyone who creates a job order. They then have the option of selecting that workflow.
Okay, awesome. Okay, that was great. Thank you so much, Josh. If there are no more questions, we'll end it here. If anyone has questions over the next couple days, feel free to email myself or Josh. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming. We hope you have a great weekend. And we will send out communication regarding the next webinar. We're taking Good Friday off, but we'll be back on April 9th. So, okay.
Wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.